let you know.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we are ready to go, Councillor Day.
Awesome, thank you so much. And thanks for the quick link. Much appreciated. So I will start with welcoming everyone and acknowledge that we are meeting on the shared traditional lands of the Coast Salish people. If everybody could unmute, and we'll do a quick roll call. Councillor Baxter.
Here.
Councillor Parkinson.
I'm here.
Councillor Logan.
Here.
Mayor Martin.
Present.
Councillor Kobayashi.
I'm here.
Councillor Jansen.
Present.
Excellent. We are all here. So our first order of business is approval of the agenda, including the near term, long term, and our committee of the whole agenda for this evening. Are there any amendments that anyone wants to propose? Questions? If I may, then I have one question on the coming up on May 17th. We're scheduled to look at the transportation master plan. And then we also have on our longer term agenda, the very last page of it, where it says 2022 quarter to be determined. We are also looking at a compensation philosophy in 2022 with human resources. Sorry, I got that mixed up. It's also in Q3 coming up. There it is, bottom of page 8 of our agenda. Review the city's compensation organizational structure against comparables. I'm just wondering, are we doing both? And are they as related as I thought they were? Mr. Earl.
Thank you, Chair Day. I believe the first one is a review of our compensation against comparables. And we would use that information then once we have it to help develop a compensation philosophy, which then is next.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I just thought they seemed like the same thing. Excellent. So I'm looking for approval of the agenda. Councillor Baxter, I'm assuming that's a moving it, and Councillor Kobayashi, is that a second? Okay, seeing no one saying that I'm wrong, I will call the agenda adopted, approved. And next we have adoption of the minutes. We have the committee of the whole from March 15th, the special committee of the whole from March 16th and March 29th. Any comments on the minutes?
Excuse me, Chair. You asked for a mover and seconder for the agenda, but you didn't call the question.
Oh, you're right. I'm sorry. Let's back up the train a little bit here. Call the vote on the approval of the agenda. Anyone opposed to the adoption of the agenda? Seeing none, that is carried. Next, we have adoption of the minutes. March 15th, March 16th, and March 29th. Any concerns with the minutes? Oh, I see I have Councillor Parkinson. Are you moving the minutes or you have a comment?
No, happy to move the minutes, Your Worship.
Thank you. Councillor Jansen, you're seconding? Okay, I see a nod. That's excellent. That is moved and seconded. Is anyone opposed to the minutes? Councillor Jansen, but I think that was just your hand before. I figured it out. I need to lower the hands. Perfect. Moving on to our public participation. Do we have anyone tonight?
We have no one registered to speak, and we have not received any written submissions tonight.
Excellent, thank you. Moving on then, we are at item 5.1 with Jill Collinson, tools to encourage non-residential development.
Just bear with me here as I prepare this slideshow. Can everybody see that?
It could be bigger. We're seeing your previews as well.
How's that?
It still could be bigger.
That's about the biggest I can get it. How's that?
Okay, we'll go with it.
Okay, so you may recall that late in 2020, Council resolved staff bring forth tool options to encourage non-residential development within the city. This report before you tonight offers a summary of tools for initial consideration and requests further direction. So the lessening of costs, expedition of processes, and enhancing desirability are some key ways to encourage non-residential development. With that in mind, a range of tools is offered for discussion and thematically focused into 3 areas: that of taxation, economic development, and regulation and land use. So we'll start with taxation. So taxation tools offered for discussion include the reduction of the business tax rate and/or expansion of the tax exemption program. So last year, a 5-year phased program to reduce the business tax rate commenced to ultimately align Colwood's business tax rate with others in the region. The intent of the regional alignment was to help attract businesses and encourage a post-pandemic rebound. Considerations offered for you include affirmation of this 5-year reduction approach to decelerate or accelerate the rate of reduction, or decide upon an alternative multiplier. Another taxation tool offered is a revitalization tax exemption program, which is ultimately a bylaw enabling exemption from taxes to land and/or the improvements on that land. It can be applied geographically, by property class, and/or by land uses. There's currently 1 property in Colwood which participates in the exemption program, which is the Hotel on Whale Road, and also direction for RBCM archives to be considered. So another tool area noted in the report relates to economic development. So promotion of the city aligns with investment attraction, and thus another tool to be offered is expansion or extension of the Colwood is Calling campaign, including consideration to focus it towards more digital medium. Another tool offered is BRIA, or a business retention and attraction program. So in February, through the Economic Recovery Plan, Council resolved a mayoral forum on this. The initiative is intended to create a strong foundation and support existing businesses, attract new ones that best match Colwood business environment and our demographic profile. Information garnished through the upcoming mayoral forum is anticipated to offer input and determine needs and approaches to draw targeted investment to Colwood. So it may be beneficial to support sector-based target marketing as another non-residential tool tactic. Thus, once targeted sectors are identified via the mayoral forums, the city could choose to undertake a sector-based marketing campaign. Another consideration would be creation of an economic development function to help implement which may be implemented through special project consideration via the 2022 budget process. So the third tool area thematically is land use and regulatory based. So most of this relates to the streamlining of processes, fees, and customer service offered. That tends to form all of these recommendations. So this could include pre-zoning or upzoning of targeted properties, looking for timing and efficiencies in development approval and building permitting processes, and/or looking at our fees. Essentially, the quicker the timeline to enable development and construction, the sooner commercial and industrial activity can establish. So time and cost is a huge factor, but so is the service experience offered through various application processes. A non-residential Colwood concierge service could provide commercial and industrial developers with a formal service to help facilitate the development applications from beginning through to end. So this is a lengthy report with multiple recommendations. The recommendations are summarized on the above slide and on page 1 of your report. The number reflects to the thematic section. So 1 being taxation, 2 being economic development, and 3 being land use and regulatory. And then obviously the letter is the corresponding option. I'll leave this slide up here, and any questions I'm happy to answer.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask that you take down your slide for now, and you could bring it back later, but when your slide is up, I can't see anybody. Great. Questions for Jill or Ms. Collinson? I recognize Councillor Parkinson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to start by complimenting Jill. Excellent report, very thorough. Don't agree with a lot of what you're recommending here, but you gave me the information to understand it and to make decisions on. So I thought it was very well done. And I'm not sure, Chair, how you want to lead us through this on picking and choosing what of the many recommendations we like in here. So I'll shut up for now until we get a process going.
So I think probably the best process will be to look at each bullet in the recommendation in order that they are. So the first would be to continue the 5-year phased program that began in 2020 to reduce the business tax rate multiplier to 3.67. And that is noted as 1A.
So do I still have the floor?
You do.
In that case, I'm going to suggest that we don't bother with that, while I think we're all supportive of reducing the business rate tax in a phased manner over 5 years, we took a significant chunk out of it last year. I think we've got 3 or 4 years worth of reduction already done. And we noticed also, we heard last week that the assessments for the businesses in town went down this year. So they've got probably are at the average they were. I would suggest that this is something that could be left to council on an annual thing to tweak or adjust a little bit here and there in the future. So I would recommend against 1A.
Okay, I have a speakers list, and I should have talked about the process before I did that list. So I am open. Next, I have Councillor Kobayashi.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm going to have to actually agree with Councillor Parkinson on this one. It's because, I'll tell you why. It's erroneous on our part right now to effectively keep adjusting, the mill rates, because the overall tax picture is a product of mill rate and assessment value. And because the assessment value went down, plus the mill rates went down, the overall burden over to residential was even greater than anticipated because assessment values actually went down. So I don't think you can look at just mill rates in isolation. You have to look at both. And I think that I believe the same thing. Finance department can actually predetermine this because we do get the assessment values in January, and we can look at the mill rates and adjust them accordingly. So we can, in effect, get the same, we're going to get the end result that we want, rather than a little bit of a shock this time around when, in fact, the assessment values went down. And so the portion onto the residential was even greater than the difference in the mill rates. So I'm going to support what Councillor Parkinson has stated. Thank you.
Thank you. Next on my list, I have Councillor Mayor Martin. Sorry.
Thank you. I certainly don't want to question Councillor Parkinson or Kobayashi on their belief sets, But sorry, my understanding is that the 3.67 is a multiplier and doesn't really have anything to do with the mill rates, and that the multiplier right now is 3.93 or something along those lines, and that it was a desire of this council to move that multiplier down to 3.67, and that we would continue to do that through a 5-year phase program to get ourselves to be competitive with Langford and other jurisdictions that have a multiplier of that number. Now, what I've heard from Councillor Parkinson and Kobayashi is something completely different from my understanding. So I don't know if do we have the Director of Finance on tonight, or anyone from the Finance Department?
Thank you, Mayor Martin, through the chair. The tax rate multiplier, or the ratio, it is directly related to property tax rates. So when we talk about the commercial or the business ratio, that is how many times the commercial tax rate is of the residential tax rate. So there are a number of tactics we can consider. One that council has provided previous direction on is to reduce the commercial ratio or multiplier. The implication of that is we have to consider how our assessment base is shifting. So combined, our residential and our commercial assessment base makes up about 99.6% of our entire assessment base for the city. But when we look at the split between commercial and residential back a decade ago, back in 2010, our commercial portion was higher. It was closer to 10% of the overall assessment base, and it has decreased over time. A direct result, we've commented on this previously, our residential development is outpacing our commercial development. And so the direction we received at the most recent council meeting was to maintain that multiplier. And that's something Councillor Parkinson spoke to moments ago. Last year, we reduced that multiplier. In 2019, it was about 4.5 times. Our businesses were paying 4.5 times. We reduced that multiplier, and we are now looking at maintaining that. Another factor to consider is, depending on how your tax base shifts, that doesn't necessarily mean that that class, so the business class of properties, that they're carrying the same tax burden. And so that's another factor to consider, is to not provide that direction on the tax rates to maintain a specific multiplier, but rather provide direction, if your property taxes for your residential class are going to go up X percent, you want that same percentage impact on your business class. And that would impact the ratio. We wouldn't be able to maintain a fixed ratio and maintain a fixed percentage impact. So it's one or the other, because we have to consider how our assessment base is changing. And here in Colwood right now, our assessment base is growing every year, but our residential is outpacing our commercial right now.
So, Chair, I just have a follow-up question to that comment from Ms. Tempting, if I may.
Sure.
Thank you. So how do we create assurances for our business community and our commercial community if they don't know what the multiplier is, and if we're adjusting it on a yearly basis? Sorry, that was to Ms. Tempting.
It's one of the factors to consider. So that tactic is one that council has endorsed and has provided direction on, because it will reduce the taxes that are paid by that assessment class. And so right now, We are bringing forward the tax rate bylaw next week under the direction to maintain that multiplier. And for some of our, there are a number of commercial properties that they've seen their assessments drop in 2021. And so overall, they're realizing a greater savings for the municipal taxes over last year, because not only have the assessments dropped, but that multiplier has also been maintained. And the residential tax base is sharing more of the burden. So I hope that answered your question, but endorsing tactics such as maintaining multipliers, that is one way of sending a message on the stance for property tax collection.
Thank you. Did that answer your question, Mayor Martin?
Yes, thank you. Although I do see Mr. Earl's hand up. I would be interested in hearing his comment.
Okay, Mr. Earl.
Thank you, Chair Day, and through to Mayor Martin. As Ms. Hepting has indicated, the multiplier is one tactic that council can use to target change. Council could communicate a range of multiplier to provide some level of certainty to either the business or the residential community. Council could also indicate a percentage change. So if the municipality was determined to, if the tax rate change for a given year was overall, for example, 6%, and council wanted the rate of change in the business sector to be less than that, council could provide that by way of policy. And so then administration would take into account both the tax rate and the differential in the rate of change of like-for-like properties. As Ms. Hepting has indicated, a like-for-like residential property in Colwood this year compared to last year went up in value. A like-for-like commercial property in Colwood this year compared to last year did not, or did not to the same degree, and in some instances went down. And so including the differential rate of change of assessed value of like-for-like properties would allow council to better or more precisely target change rather than just focusing on the multiplier.
Sorry, can you repeat that last bit again about rather than the multiplier?
So locking into the multiplier then potentially has the impact of exacerbating differential rates of change. And so if one sector, residential versus non-residential, appreciated or depreciated at a different pace than the other, locking to the multiplier would amplify that. And so what council is getting is overshooting what you originally intended because of the nature of the other change that's going on. As Councillor Kobayashi precisely pointed out, it's tax rate times assessed value that matters. And so focusing on the rate alone only tells part of the story.
Great, thank you. And next on my speakers list is Councillor Baxter. You're on mute, Councillor Baxter.
I am, thank you. Inevitably. As Jen Hepting indicated, we have already given instructions on this. There was already a council resolution, and the resolution has an effect very much in line with option A under taxation. And I'm sure that the finance department has already done all the calculations ready for the bylaw. And I think if we want to change direction, I think it would be a good idea to wait until next year. We're not talking about a vast change in direction. Anyway, at the moment, we're keeping the multiplier the same, and that will have the effect on taxes that we've already been told about. So we don't need to adopt anything on this. So I suggest we move on.
Thank you. Anyone, I'm just going to weigh in a smidgen, knowing that we want to move on, but I do think it's very important that we remain competitive, especially when businesses may be making the choice of where to set up shop or whether to move locations. So we are very much, I think, focused on trying to, I think unanimously, council is interested in increasing the number of businesses in Colwood that are available to serve our very expanding residential population. What the best way to do that is, I think it is more through stability than through tinkering with the rates. So I am in agreement with several others that this can wait, but I do understand why we set out on this path. I don't see any other hands wishing to speak to this, so I'm going to move on to the next bullet, which is investigating and identifying possible sectors or geographics for inclusion into revitalization tax exemption program for consideration. Councillor Kobayashi.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just you were going to treat each of these separately, you said. So do you want one of us to make a motion on the recommendation then for the last one? Like some, because we have 4 options, correct?
4 options. I'm not following you on the 4 options.
So if you look at the reading, they recommended one of the options in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 bullets, right?
Oh yes, yeah.
But they gave us a staff report and they basically squared off the option that they wanted. So so do you not want to close off each of these with a recommendation then? What the recommendation is? Just to close it?
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from, Councillor Kobayashi, but I think that we might close off some options by deciding one by one, rather than looking at the package as a whole. That is sort of how the recommendation came forward, was as a whole package of actions, but whatever you think would be better. I'm fine with doing it either way. I just thought that we might have a suggestion that was all encompassing once we had the discussion.
It doesn't matter to me, Chair. You're the chair.
Okay.
I would have just recommended doing each of them separately so we can just close it and get on to the next one, sort of thing, instead of have to go back and revisit each of these again.
Well, you may have a very good point. So let's take you up on your kind offer to give us some order here.
So I'd like to make the motion that recommendation D, it's a good compromise, Councillor Baxter. I wouldn't suggest that we bring that into effect this year because the financial plan is done. But certainly have this in place for next year. But recommendation D is that staff be directed return with an alternative business tax rate approach for consideration. And is exactly what we were just talking about, which considers both the mill rate and the assessment value. So they can come back to us in a fair way so we can achieve the same objective of bringing down our overall taxes to our businesses, but not to basically exuberate or exaggerate the difference in the charges this year because of the fact that assessment values went down and the mill rates went down. So they got a bonus this year. In essence, it was a double whammy, but in effect it was to the detriment of the residential taxes. So we can come up with a fairer system. I heard that right now. I think Jen Hepting and the CAO had mentioned that there could be another way. So what I'm just to summarize, I would recommend a number D, that the staff do be directed to return with an alternate business tax rate approach for council approval. So that's my motion.
Thank you. Councillor Baxter, I recognize that your hand is up. Do you wish to speak to this motion, or shall I come back to you after the vote?
Well, above all else, I want to clarify the motion. Is Councillor Kobayashi suggesting that the finance department return next year with this new idea? Okay. You don't need a seconder, so I don't need to second, so I'm done.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else wishing to speak to this motion? I'm not seeing any, so I will call the question. Are there any opposed to bringing this back next year with an alternate business tax rate approach? I have Mayor Martin opposed. That is carried. Thank you. Moving on to the second bullet, investigating and identifying possible sectors or geographics for inclusion into a revitalization tax exemption program for consideration. Councillor Parkinson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So in keeping with Councillor Kobayashi's approach, which I think is a good one, I'd be prepared to move that staff take, which is G, item G, the staff take no action and tax exemption considerations be considered at the request of a developer at the time of individual project consideration.
Thank
I'm
you.
happy to speak to that.
Yes, I think it'd be a good idea to speak to that.
So essentially, the tax exemption that, as you mentioned, was used on the hotel and has been proposed and accepted for the museum has real benefits for specific things. But absent a stated desire or a real purpose, there's lots of thought could go into it, or lots of what ifs and what to fors. I think that they don't happen very often. They're not readily approvable, I wouldn't think. So I'm not sure how often they've happened in your experience, but I wouldn't expect to see them happen very often. And so if and when they occur, I think council is well and truly able to decide whether they agree with the idea or not, and to try to do a blanket policy ahead of time. I don't see the benefit of that. So that's why I'm moving that at this point we take no action. I don't think it means we wouldn't ever consider one, but without one to consider, it's probably more a speculative exercise. Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you. Next, I have Councillor Baxter.
I'm going to speak against this motion, and here's why. It's a rather passive motion, and I feel that the whole development business too often seems to happen while we sit still and look to see what happens next. And I think in this case in particular, that's a bad thing, because it means that the only people who will get tax exemptions, they might not, but the only people who can possibly get a tax exemption are the sharp developers that realize that the rules say they can apply for one in this case. Where there might be other areas where they would do us more good by encouraging people to make developments of a certain sort in certain zones of the city. And because we didn't look at that, that never happens, and we don't get the development encouragement that this is all about. Equally, we could have it investigated, and the council could decide in the end that no, they're not really, tax exemptions aren't needed to develop anywhere in Colwood. We can't find anywhere where they would do any good. And then we know we've got an end to them, and there's a warning out there to any developer to not bother applying because we won't get one. Either way, we've made the decision based on information that is not presented by a developer, but is presented by our own staff. So I'd be more likely to go with E, and I certainly oppose this motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I have Councillor Logan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I too will be opposing the motion. I think this is one concrete tactic that we can use that we can employ to attract, certain types of businesses that we want to see in certain parts of our municipality. And we know it works, and we know that it's a tactic that's employed and has been successful in other municipalities. It's planned, it's targeted, and I think council and the city has the opportunity to set the direction where this revitalization tax exemption program could be considered. I think we set the criteria. And so I think we should be investigating and identifying possible sectors. That's the only way we got the hotel, frankly. If we didn't have that tax exemption, there's high likely that we wouldn't have gotten that hotel. And I think we need to be a little more aggressive. And this is concrete. This is a serious message that we could send to a sector that we are interested in, that we're willing to help you out. And in this time of need, that we're willing to take a little bit of that risk on so you can get established, looking at the long-term benefits. So I don't think we've got anything to lose here, but everything to benefit. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I have Councillor Kobayashi.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I just want to give everyone here the benefit of two different economic development courses I have taken. One is only 5 years ago, and the other one 7 years ago. One offered in Alberta, and it was in Calgary, and the other one here was over in Kelowna. And tax exemptions is an interesting subject, because that's basically what the first tactic that every city tries to take on, because it's an easy tactic to do. It makes everyone's job a lot easier. So if I could give everyone the benefit of what I learned, and this is no BS here, but it is not the number one tactic that we should be taking. In fact, you'd be very surprised to find out it's way down on the list. You should not be doing this. In fact, we were told you should not be doing this. This is not the incentive to work. And there's other ways of earning this. And it's too bad we didn't have this training and bring a person that come in and teach us all about economic development and how you do business attraction. I was hoping that one of the speakers that we had would have brought that up, but it didn't come up. So I just thought I'd just point this out to everyone to consider. And I don't think Councillor Parkinson was suggesting that we don't give them. We do them, but we do it on a case-by-case basis. That's how you do this. If you give blanket ones right now, maybe if you're all trying to attract hundreds of hotels here, you would do that. But, if you're looking at having a variety of different industry here, you look at every one of them, and the criteria you might build up is, the number of jobs it creates, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, with the potential tax revenues. You'd look at all that stuff all together. So I don't think, the recommendation G says you don't do it. It's just saying that you're doing it on a case-by-case basis. But like I said, I'm just trying to give everyone here the benefit of the training that I had, that although I'm no arguing with Councillor Logan, they're great things to hand out. There's no doubt about it. But it's the last thing they tell us that we should be doing. We're just going against all the wisdom out there. So I just thought I'd point this out to everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Since I have no other hands, I'm going to take a moment for myself. And what I have heard over the years, talking to businesses, some of them who've been here for a long time, who told me that what mattered the most to them was the support for their business, the cooperation, the recognition, the highlighting of your businesses within your community meant a great deal to a number of local businesses that I talked to. And I think that it's easy to, think that, if we just build the right system, it's all going to support exactly what we want, and we're going to end up with the community that we want. But the world doesn't quite work that logically, and it has a lot more to do with whether or not you've heard about that business, whether you've heard good things about them. If someone told you a good story about a local business, you're more likely to want to try them out. And that's where I'm coming from. I want to be very careful with our tax dollars, because I know how hard it is for everyone, whether you're a business or a resident, to pay your taxes at the end of the year. It's universal. But I do want to support our businesses, and especially on page 2 of the report, it talks about how no matter what we do, we're going to remain largely residential in the foreseeable future. But what I do want for sure to make happen is that the residents that are here can find what they need close to home. That's going to be good for the environment. That's going to be good for our local businesses. So I am quite comfortable with the motion that's on the floor to take no action until individual projects come forward, and then the community can support them. That gives the opportunity for the community to step up and say, yes, we need this here, and we'll be supporting it. And it also keeps everyone in the loop, so that these things don't become an automatic emptying of your rear pocket when you're not noticing, but that you actually are active in your community. So I like it for those reasons. And I still have a hand here from Councillor Baxter. Have you spoken to this one? I believe you did.
I have spoken, but if you would allow, I'd like to speak again.
I'll indulge you briefly.
Hey, I'll speak briefly. 2 councillors have spoken fairly negatively about the idea of having any tax exemptions, and yet we're in the process of trying to choose between 2 different resolutions, both of which support having tax exemptions. So I wonder if one of them might want to make a motion that we have no tax exemptions. No, okay, so they are a good thing. The other assumption that I think has crept into the decision is that Resolution E results in automatic award of tax exemptions. And I'm not at all sure it does. Is there anybody who could enlighten me one way or the other? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next, I'm going to go to Councillor Johnson, first time speaker.
Point of order, I'd like an answer to the question.
Councillor Baxter, I can answer that question, and perhaps Councillor Parkinson can clarify his position. I never said that. I said case by case.
I want a factual answer from staff. Does E produce automatic tax exemptions in a particular area or not?
Through the chair, I can offer a response there. The way the recommendation is read, it's just a report to be brought forward offering more information regarding establishment of such a program, and or considerations for what could or couldn't be included within that. So a further investigative report does not result in a tax exemption program, but does offer further investigation and identification of possible considerations for establishing.
Thank you. Councillor Jansen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to use my time to suggest that we actually call the vote here because this is a long laundry list. I'm
Okay.
prepared to vote. Thank you.
All right. I did have Councillor Kobayashi's hand up. You're fine. Okay, good. I will call the question. All those opposed? Councillor Logan, Mayor Martin, and Councillor Jansen are opposed. Oh, and Councillor Baxter. So that motion has failed. Would someone wish to move a different motion? Oh, sorry. Councillor Jansen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to move the staff recommendation for a further report. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Baxter, did you wish to speak to the motion?
I was going to do the same as Councillor Jensen.
Thank you. So not seeing any hands, I will call the vote on the motion, which is number E, that staff be directed to bring forth a report investigating and identifying possible sectors or geographics for inclusion into a revitalization tax exemption program for consideration. All those opposed? I see none opposed. That is carried. Okay, moving back to our laundry list. Then third bullet is to prioritize the mayoral forum for business retention, expansion, and attraction program. And that is with 2C. Looking for hands to discuss this option. Councillor Baxter.
I move 2C.
Thank you. Councillor Johnson.
I'm good, thanks.
Okay. Councillor Parkinson.
Sorry, I wonder if somebody could remind me what the mayoral forum for business retention, expansion, and attraction is.
I'm looking for staff.
Hi, Madam
Oh.
Chair, I can answer that question if you'd like.
Okay, Mr. Borhill.
Certainly. So there's been a couple presentations to council sitting as committee from folks that have been involved in our current activities as it relates to economic recovery. And what we're talking about in this program is an offshoot from the conversations we've had with the existing business community to formalize tactics and strategies that would help to expand existing businesses, retain existing businesses, but also incentivize new businesses to come to Colwood. So in what we've heard so far, we really need to focus on our competitive advantages so that we're targeting the types of businesses that are a good fit for Colwood, and to also develop our lines of communication and levels of service to our business community to fulfill that mandate.
Thank you. Councillor Parkinson.
Thank you for that, Mr. Borhill and Chair.
Okay. Go. Seeing no further hands, I'm looking for a motion. Oh, we have a motion. Sorry, my apologies. Motion is on the floor. All those opposed? Seeing none, that is carried. Moving on to our fourth bullet, targeted sectors will be identified by a business retention, expansion, and attraction program. The city undertake a sector-based marketing campaign, and this is 2D. Once targeted sectors are identified by a business retention program, the city would undertake a marketing campaign. And Councillor Jansen.
I'll move that. Thank you.
Okay. And Councillor Kobayashi.
I'm good.
Okay, thank you. Seeing no hands, I will call the question. Any opposed? So I see none opposed. That is carried. Okay, we are on to bullet 5. An economic development function is considered as a special project initiative via the 2022 service review and budget considerations. And the recommendation is 2E, that an economic development function is considered as a special project initiative via the 2022 service review. Councillor Baxter.
There are no options given to this in the text, I don't believe. So yeah, in the text on page 5, there are no options, and I want to oppose the suggestion. So I guess the best way I can do that is just move that we move on to the next one without doing anything with this recommendation.
Okay, there is a motion to bypass this bullet and move on with the next discussion on the motion. Mayor Martin.
Thank you. If this motion was to pass, can staff please comment on what direction they would follow then?
If an economic development function was considered as a special project via the 2022 service review and budget considerations?
No, that it isn't.
That it is not. That's what the motion is before us. So my question is, if that bullet point doesn't move forward, what's the direction of the staff? What direction would staff consider in regards to economic development functions?
Within the report on page 9, option 4, other, is just council may also choose to identify other tools or take no further action on any of the above items. So there is no alternative offered. You are welcome to offer an alternative.
No, I'm sorry, that's not my question. My question is the motion before us, and I'm repeating, and correct me if I'm wrong, Councillor Baxter, but the motion before us is that we don't. So my question to staff is, if we don't do that bullet point, what would staff be doing in regards to the economic development function?
Yeah, and I understand the reply staff has given. I made an error. I didn't see that there was a D&E. No, I can't. Sorry, is staff saying there are 2 options given on the page where this occurs?
There is one option related to this function. I believe Mayor Martin is asking, how does the function action now? And if this option was not actioned, how would it continue to option in the future? Currently, this is under the community planning department function, and I see Mr. Borhill has his hand up, so I will let him offer further information.
Thanks, Jill. Ms. Collinson. Mr. Borhill.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So if this option was recommended for council's endorsement, staff would simply be putting together the information as part of the service review that's upcoming for 2022 this fall. So you'd be able to understand fully what staff's proposing as an economic development function that would essentially be an outgrowth of our recovery efforts at the moment. Commonly, economic development is undertaken through a staff person that's designated as an economic development officer or economic development program coordinator. And that key person is often mainly doing communicative work with the business community and potential investors in the community. So just, I guess, to finish off the response, if this wasn't endorsed, staff would simply not put that information together for the service review and budget deliberations.
Okay, thank
Sure.
you, Mr. Borhill. Anything further, Mayor Martin?
No, thank you.
Okay, Councillor Kobayashi.
Thank you very much, Chair Day. So I just want to make sure I understand this, Mr. Borhill. So through the chair to Mr. Borhill. So what you're saying is that if we say no to that, what we're in essence saying is that economic development is not important to the city? Is that what we're saying here? I just want to make sure that I'm clear, because if you're not putting a report together of this, and so what we're saying in essence, it's not something we want to do as a city. Am I interpreting this right? I just want to be clear in my own head now. I thought I understood what this was before, but now I'm not too sure.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would state to Councillor Kobayashi that really it's about prioritization of council's resources as it relates to the different functions we undertake. I see our Chief Administrative Officer has turned on his video, so I'll defer to him if he's got any additional comment.
Thank you. Mr. Earl.
Thank you, Chair Day, and through to Councillor Kobayashi. Fundamentally, the City of Colwood does not have an economic development function as we sit here today. And what this option is suggesting is during service review this fall, do you want to see options with associated price tags to develop an economic development function? This particular report suggests that it be started as a special project, and as council is well aware, special projects are not tax funded. They are funded through reserves. And so this particular report says, recognizing that a lot of work is about to be done on economic development, targeting business retention, expansion, and attraction, do you want to then form a function that would help move that work along and tactically use special project funding for up to 3 years before you consider whether or not this should be a tax-supported function? Again, right now, Colwood has no economic development function. This, if it were supported, would bring you options at service review to either support or not support.
Thank you very much for clarifying that, CEO. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm just going to take my 2 minutes with this one. This is a very difficult initiative for me because it's one that we've been working on for 10 plus years in trying to find a way to shoehorn economic development into our administration. And I think this is it's very important for Colwood, because as we get more and more residential development happening, it's important for us to have local options for the services that we need. And that's been going on for as long as I've lived in Colwood, is trying to keep businesses nearby that can be successful and provide the services that we need without having to go, using up all the atmosphere with our cars to get what we need. We need to have things locally. And as much as I am very aware of the costs of creating another work area for the city, I'm also very aware of the costs that are incurred when we don't do it. So when I first started going to UBCMs, we would have little northern towns talking about their economic development officer. And I thought, how is it that they have all that stuff going on and we don't? And how do we get on this bandwagon? So I really like that this is put forward as a special project so that we can try to get it right and we can evaluate what we choose. It's not a one and done kind of initiative. It's tried out, do some tinkering and come up with a way to make this work in the future. So I think it is a good idea. And I've lost my train of thought. Do we have a motion on the floor yet?
Yes.
We do. Okay. Staff, could staff read back the motion?
So the motion that Councillor Baxter put forward was to bypass this recommendation and move forward to the next recommendation. So I'm thinking that it's to not support the special project initiative. Is that what Mayor Martin, I believe, clarified? Instead of consider it was not to support it.
Okay. All right. So that is the motion that's on the floor. Sorry that I got lost for a moment there, and let's call the question. Those opposed? Mayor Martin, Councillor Kobayashi, Councillor Logan, Councillor Jansen, and myself are all opposed. That is failed. Would someone like to make a different recommendation? Sorry. And Councillor Kobayashi.
I'll make the motion for the recommended option, option E, that the economic development function is considered as a special project initiative via 2022 service review budget considerations.
Thank you. I think we've talked this one quite a bit, so I'm going to call the question. All those opposed, please raise your hands. I see none opposed, so that is carried. Next bullet is to continue with the upzoning consideration for Colwood Corners and the transit growth areas along Soup Road as part of the upcoming land use bylaw project. And I have a couple hands. Councillor Johnson.
I'm going to move the recommendation.
Thank you. And Councillor Parkinson. Oh, you're on mute.
That's because it was Michael's turn, so I unmuted him.
No, that's because you got older.
Yes, could be it. Yeah, could be it. Actually, I'm not a believer in upzoning anyway. I think that that's not appropriate. We have an OCP, which I think gives anybody coming to town a pretty good idea of what could or couldn't be considered on a piece of property. Upzoning, I think by definition, would have to be broad enough to attract a number of different industries and maybe too broad. So I think that over the last couple of years, we've shown ourselves to be able to move rezonings through pretty expeditiously. I very much don't agree, even if the rest of council believes that there's some merit to upzoning Colwood Corners. The transit growth areas are residential areas. I'm not sure what they're doing in this report. I don't think we should inadvertently stick a bunch of the residential upzoning into here, which again is something that I don't agree with. So certainly would vote against the motion.
Thank you. Not seeing any other hands. I will mention that I am also opposed to this motion. I don't like the idea of the blanket upzoning. There is a lot of revenue that's associated with the work that we are going to have to do anyways. This, in my view, would be doing the work without getting any compensation for it. So I won't be supporting it myself. And with that, I will call the question. Those opposed? Sorry, having difficulties here. We have Councillor Kobayashi, Councillor Parkinson, and Councillor Day are all opposed, and that is carried. The next bullet is to review the land use application procedures bylaw number 427 for the purposes of benchmarking our development procedures and fees. I have Councillor Parkinson.
Well, that's lucky. I think my hand was left up from before, but I'm happy to move that motion.
Okay. And next on my list is Councillor Baxter.
I'd just like an explanation from staff on what would happen if this passed.
Ms. Collinson?
Through the chair. So this is in relation to 3F, am I correct?
Review the land use application procedures bylaw for the purposes of benchmarking our development procedures and fees.
So within bylaw 427, there is language that stipulates we do review this every 5 years. So what we do is we look at what our neighbors, where their fees are, and to ensure that we are consistent and competitive with our surrounding neighbors. So that's part of what the benchmarking would enable.
Okay, and just a follow up from me, since this is already in our plan to do every 5 years, are we doing it sooner? Is that why the motion?
2021 would be year 5, so it would and should commence by year end. It may carry over into 2022.
Okay.
Madam Chair, if I could just add to Ms. Collinson's response there. So the previous fee review included in it an inbuilt 5-year review, which would happen within the next 12 months. It was intended at that time to capture inflation, not necessarily other factors that council might want to take into consideration when reviewing fees. For example, reducing fees as an incentive to certain types of development. Those aren't considerations that are foreseen into that automatic review. So with this option, it does provide for a more meaningful and robust review of the procedures bylaw and the fees than what would otherwise happen on a 5-year basis.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have a motion. I'm not seeing any hands, so I will call the question. Those opposed, please raise your hand.
We spend the money to go to work. So it's
Sorry about that. My fault.
All right, I'm not seeing any opposed, so that is carried. And the last bullet is outlining details of a Colwood concierge service, including budget implications and economic development impact, as well as program eligibility criteria considerations. And this was 3G. Councillor Parkinson.
Well, I'd hate to think that any prospective developer coming to the city of Colwood wouldn't be receiving these kind of services as we speak. You know, I would hope that somebody coming saying, I'd like to do a project of significant size in Colwood is treated very well and given the, given the information they need. So I'm not sure. It looks like there was already agreement to get into the economic development game at some cost. This looks like it's an addition to that. I just wonder if it's necessary. So maybe staff could be a little more fulsome in their defense of this.
Thank you. Staff?
Through the chair. So this is just offered as an option for your consideration. The intent of the option is that often when an application is going through a development process, it may start at rezoning, wind up through a development permit, go through a lengthy building permit process and so on, and the entire suite of process may take some time. Throughout that time, there's different application managers for each part. This concierge would offer a one-stop shop, essentially. It would help to streamline and navigate and almost serve as an in-house project manager for the suite of applications that would come along with that type of service.
Thank you. Councillor Kobayashi.
Thank you very much, Chair Day. Through you to Jill, I guess my question is, I know we don't even have a checklist that we can provide a person that wants to do a development here that steps them through everything. So wouldn't that be the first logical step we'd want to do instead of hiring someone to do this? That's question number one. And my second question is, is there another city that, or one of the other municipalities that actually has this service? Not that I know of, but if you can enlighten me, I'd certainly like to know. Thank you.
So through the chair, I'll offer answer to the second part of that question first. This is a tactic that is used by other local governments, not so many within our direct area, but it is used in other parts of the province as well as the country as kind of an enticing service option to set them apart from other locals. So, and I see Mr. Borhill has turned his camera on, so I will let him answer the first part of that question.
Thank you. And I also see that we have Mr. Molnar waiting to speak as well, just so everyone's on the same page.
Just to add to Ms. Colson's response, I think it would be behooving upon us to look at our existing practices and to the extent to which additional resources would be brought to bear. That would probably be the key information that we would bring forward as in support of this item. And a quick Google search brought forward numerous municipalities that take this approach throughout North America. So we can respond with that background information as well if required.
Thank you, Mr. Borhill. And I believe Mr. Molnar.
Thank you very much to the chair, to the members of council. I'm pleased to advise that we do have a checklist. We also follow up with all of our clients with a next step procedures book. So in every single document that is issued by development services, we actually tell the persons, this is what we've received, this is what your next step are. And we actually walk them through the checklist because we find it to be very beneficial in letting the applicant know where their process is and where their procedure is. There's often times where we've done a review and it's up the applicant's request to move it forward again. And so they need to know what we're waiting on. And so I'm very pleased to advise that, as Councillor Kobayashi pointed out, we do have a single file manager per file. They are being shepherded through the process. They are equipped with a checklist. They can walk in and receive that at the door. And I'm even more pleased to advise that we actually walk them through the next step with a handhold by that singular person in development services that relies on their team to then make sure that we're all aligned and delivering the same information. So I hope that backfills the information. There's always value in reaching out, but and improving. And so I'm pleased to say that we're having a good start.
So with everything that you're doing, Mr. Molnar, how does this recommendation impact that? Does it expand your services?
Thanks very much. The question for me is more to come from, are that person that's receiving concierge service paying higher fees for an accelerated rate? Everyone is dealt with at the order in which they're received, and they're all held equal. And staff deal with applicants in regards to the order of which information is received. And so if we have a report to review, it gets reviewed before the report that's received later on that day. And then we work with the applicant, it gets delivered to the applicant with the list on this is what we'd like to see improve, this is where you're at. And then we sit back. And so I do grant that at that point where we put it into the applicant's hands, we give them the space to be able to explore their horizons, as well as reach out to staff for looking for clarity. So I see this as being, well, a value added service that if council wished to add it, they would look to trump other factors, perhaps, and maybe pay higher fees. It's also a service that, as council is aware, we've been speaking a lot through the service review, as well as through the budget process about how some of our fees are not fully compensating or fully relative to the service level that's offered. And so we're going through an active fee review. We're also with development services revising our procedures to make them clear. That'll be coming to council later on the year. And so I don't know if I see a concierge service as necessarily being higher place or not, but I do see it as potentially trumping other applicants. However, we're willing to work as best as council sees fit to deliver the service the council feels necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mulder. So I believe we have a motion on the floor. I think everyone's questions have been answered. I will call the question on
Excuse me, could you repeat the motion, please, Chair?
I believe that Councillor, was it Councillor? Sorry, let's go to staff. I'm getting confused here myself.
Hi, I don't believe that we did have a motion on the table. There was nobody moving the motion.
Okay, so we're looking for a motion. You're quite right, Councillor Kobayashi. Still looking for a motion, though. Mayor Martin. Mayor Martin?
Sorry, I did it. I did it now. My apologies to everyone. I'll move the staff recommendation that we continue on with it or move forward with the investigation of the concierge service, at least for discussion.
Thank you. Okay. I'm not seeing any other hands. We have the staff recommendation on the floor. So I will call the question. All those opposed? Councillor Johnson, Councillor Kobayashi, Councillor Parkinson, and Councillor Day opposed. So that fails. So I believe that leaves us where we are. Oh, I have, there we go. Those are all the same. Thank you. Okay, moving on. Sorry, I gotta find my agenda now. I'm deep in the reports. And we're moving on. Thank you very much, Ms. Collinson and all the rest of staff. Next, we're at 5.2 with Mr. Grant, Manager of Building Inspections and Bylaw Services on-street parking.
Hello, Committee of the Whole. I was introduced there. For those of you who I haven't met yet, Chair Day said, I am the Manager of Building Inspections Bylaw Services. And tonight we have brought a study forward that explains what our on-street parking looks like now, what it may look like in the future, and some options we have to be able to manage it. So without further ado, I'll pass you to Tim Shaw with Watt Consulting.
Hello, Mr. Shaw.
Hello, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Grant. I'm just going to share my screen here so I can bring up my presentation. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes, it looks good.
Perfect. Okay, well, thanks again, Mr. Grant, and good evening, Mayor and Council. My name is Tim Shaw, and I'm the Senior Transportation Planner with Watt Consulting Group, and I was the lead on this particular project. So I'm going to spend the next about 20 minutes or so taking you through my presentation. The agenda includes, I'll start with the project purpose and the objectives of the project, paint a picture of what on-street parking is like in Colwood today, followed by the jurisdictional review that was completed, the guiding principles that we came up with for on-street parking, and then the recommendations, and then conclude with some final thoughts. So the objectives of this particular project were fourfold. First was really to understand areas of the city where on-street parking demand is highest now, but also in the future as the city continues to grow. Second was to determine changes required to the city's approach to residential parking management. The third is to outline an on-street parking management framework by which residential parking and paid parking could be managed together. And lastly, to establish a system that matches Colwood's existing enforcement capacity and one that could be expanded in the future. So moving to the on-street parking today in terms of the policy and regulatory context. The key bylaw here is the Traffic and Highways bylaw, which provides regulations around on-street parking, so including the time limits. So any vehicle in the city is allowed to park for up to 72 hours. There's also regulations on loading zones, and of course the residential parking only permit program, which I'll speak to in a few slides. There's also the OCP, which provides various policy directions on parking and on-street parking in particular, including enabling on-street parking wherever appropriate, maximizing opportunities for on-street parking. So that's especially the case in the mixed-use employment centers designation, trying to minimize the amount of off-street parking and trying to maximize the amount of on-street parking within that designation. And the last one is adapting streets over time for pickup and drop-off areas. And that policy really speaks to autonomous vehicles and emerging transportation services, ride-hailing services, food delivery services, recognizing that there's going to be more and more competition and for on-street parking and for curbside parking. Turning to parking enforcement, so there are currently 2 full-time bylaw compliance officers that spend roughly 1 to 4 hours per week on parking enforcement on average. They very much follow an educational approach based on voluntary compliance. So basically what that means is they try to inform residents about what the restrictions are and issue warnings before actually issuing tickets. There's approximately 200 parking related complaints per year. That's based on data from the past 3 years. The number of warnings that are issued is about half the number of complaints that are received. And finally, very few tickets are actually issued. Very few parking tickets are issued by bylaw compliance officers, and I'll get more into that. There are a number of parking complaints received each year, as I mentioned, about 200 on average the last 3 years. There are some hotspots. So based on some data that we got from the city, the 4 top neighborhoods that issued the most complaints were Triangle Mountain, Royal Bay, Colwood Corners, and Seaside, which made up about 60% of the total parking related complaints. Parking enforcement does have a number of challenges, but the 2 that we speak to in the report include one, just an inefficient way to track violations. So it's including both just the warnings themselves, but also the tickets. Because a lot of the warnings and tickets are mostly manually written. They're not in a database. So it requires a lot more time from staff to look through them and to identify repeat violators, for example. And there's also the municipal ticket information system, which is really becoming an outdated system in bylaw services. Colwood currently has the system in place, and it requires just a lot more staff time to actually process a ticket. And then also for parking violators, requires them to go through quite the process, including if they want to dispute their ticket, they actually have to do it through the provincial courts. So it's onerous both for the parking violator and also for bylaw services. The residential parking permit program that's currently in place in the city, its purpose is really to eliminate non-resident parking entirely from a neighborhood and leaving those spaces designated for the use of permit holding residents. 3 permits are allowed per household under the current program. It's free to obtain that permit, and there's roughly 180 permits in circulation today in the city. This map here is just showing the location of where the permit program is in effect. So Ledgeham Road, the top of the map there, and then on the bottom, the Grattan perimeter and passageway sub area. So just 2 areas or 2 sub areas of the city. There are a number of challenges, of course, with this particular permit program. One is the administrative inefficiencies. So it takes time to actually process an application for a resident who's trying to get a permit for their household. So it takes time from staff to actually to do that and to actually issue the permit. The second is a lack of criteria for the expansion of the program. It's not clear where the program is and is not suitable in the city today. There's no guidance on that. So it's also not clear to residents of Colwood how they can go about actually obtaining a permit as well. And the last one's enforcement. So the program is complaint driven, which is a good thing in terms of staff time, but because the bylaw compliance officers mostly issue warnings first, there isn't really a financial penalty. So it may not it may not deter the behavior or the misuse in terms of when people are parking on residential streets without a permit. So moving on to the jurisdictional review. So as part of this project, we also wanted to look at what other communities in BC are doing around parking management. We looked at a total of 11 communities, some in the CRD, other parts of Vancouver Island, Metro Vancouver, and also the interior. And really the purpose of reaching out to these communities was to obtain information about parking enforcement in terms of how many staff they have, how many hours are spent on parking enforcement, that kind of thing. Also, their approach to residential parking management, and really to extract some lessons learned that have some application to the city of Colwood. What we found was approximately 83 hours spent per week on parking enforcement, which is pretty considerable compared to Colwood, which, as I mentioned, was about 1 to 4 hours on average. These communities have a mix of approaches to residential parking management. Some use residential parking only, or RPO, signage, and some actually use a permit program. Almost all of them use the bylaw offense notice system for bylaw violations. So I mentioned that Colwood has the municipal ticket information system. A lot of these municipalities have moved away from that to the bylaw offense notice system, which is far more efficient for staff time. And it's also friendlier to the violator, as they can dispute their tickets through mail or by phone and deal with an independent adjudicator and not have to go through the court system. And lastly, parking enforcement technology is common in most of these communities, including the smaller ones like Duncan, and also the larger communities like Kelowna. I just want to spend the next few slides here summarizing the case studies. So we did go a bit more in depth for some of these communities just to really get a better sense of their parking enforcement approaches and also the residential parking management. And this is important because this research really informed the recommendations that we came up with. The first city here is Duncan, where there's a residential permit program in place. They utilize an educational approach to enforcement, so generally informing the public about what the restrictions are and issuing warnings before going to tickets. They utilize parking enforcement technology, a system called Omnipark, which has enabled parking enforcement to track, record, and issue parking tickets for both time-limited parking and also for residential permit parking. It replaced the old system, which didn't really allow for systematic tracking of tickets. It's also eliminated the need for data entry, so it's cut down on some staff time. And it's expandable. They started using this technology in their downtown initially, where there were more parking challenges and continue to be parking challenges. But then they've expanded the use of that technology across the city for a number of the restrictions. So it's been quite successful. The second case study here is Esquimalt, so in the CRD, that has both a residential permit program and also RPO, a residential parking only signage, as you can see in the photo. Its approach is to implement RPO signage first, then the permit program for certain contexts. What's interesting about Esquimalt is that there is a petition process in place. And what I mean by that is for time restrictions like RPO or the permit program, residents have to go through a petition process where they have to canvass and get enough support on their particular block from neighbors to actually go through with the permit, to actually have the municipality grant the permit to them. It really puts the onus on the residents to make a case for why they require residential parking or a restriction in place. The third case study, third and last, is the city of Kelowna, which both has a residential permit program and RPO. What's interesting is that they adopted a council policy for the residential permit program in 2013. And it's a publicly available document. It clearly outlines the intent of the program, the objectives, the challenges it's trying to address, and more importantly, the process by which one can go about to actually obtain the permit. So it's very transparent to the public. The city uses a data-driven approach to decide where and the type of parking restriction it puts in place. So actually doing counts and using technology to collect data on parking occupancy and parking duration date, for example, to inform what the time restriction should be. They also have a petition process in place, similar to Esquimalt, that really helps gauge neighborhood support for the restrictions and also limits complaints. And then they use various parking enforcement technology, including handheld tablets and license plate recognition, which has resulted in incredible efficiencies, flexibility, and just better overall parking enforcement. Moving to the guiding principles that we came up with for on-street parking management in Colwood. The first is parking as a limited resource. So what we mean by that is if parking is provided for free, or if it's limitless, people tend to abuse that parking. And when people abuse the parking, it takes it away from other people who are trying to find, in this case, on-street parking, whether it's a customer, a resident, or an employee. So if you treat parking as a limited resource, it requires good management tools to make sure that it's being used more efficiently and you're actually seeing turnover of the stalls. The second is on-street parking is part of public space, which really aligns with one of the goals in the OCP. And what we mean by this is really that on-street parking is part of the public realm. It's a public good, it belongs to the public, and they're not privately owned spaces. The third guiding principle is transportation choices, which also aligns with the OCP. Really recognizing that, yes, on-street parking is meant to accommodate private motor vehicles, like that's its primary purpose. But we also know that the City of Colwood has a modal hierarchy in place and is trying to accommodate multiple forms of transportation, whether it's transit, pedestrians, cycling, and emerging forms of mobility like electric vehicles. So it's just trying to find that right balance when thinking of how we actually manage on-street parking and how we prioritize planning for our streets. The recommendations, so there are three topic areas. The first is residential parking permit program, so recommendations around what the city can do. The main recommendation here is we're recommending that the city adopt a residential parking permit council policy similar to what the City of Kelowna has done, which would really outline the intent of the program, what its objectives are. It would also outline the administrative procedures of the program so the community better understands the permit program, what the criteria are, and how to actually obtain a permit. We're also recommending a petition process be put in place, which is a best practice from Esquimalt, Kelowna, other municipalities like Vancouver also have it in place. Really ensures that there's enough support and buy-in at the street block level to really make a case that if residents do really want it, they have to go through this process. An annual renewal with a fee of $30 per permit. So parking shouldn't be free. And of course, if you do start to have a pretty nominal fee of $30 per permit, which is common in other municipalities, it also helps pay for the program. A cap of 2 permits is per household is what we're recommending, which is based on the research that we did, but also based on vehicle ownership data from the City of Colwood. We know based on 2019 data, there were about 0.52 vehicles per person, or about 1.4 vehicles per household. And we know that most, not all, but most single-family homes have 2 off-street parking spaces. So with 2 permits per household, that should be sufficient to accommodate homes that have a secondary suite, for example, or a work vehicle that might require on-street parking. The last point on this is that we're also recommending the need for consistent signage. Currently, the signage in the city for the residential parking program is inconsistent. And lastly, establishing a visitor parking permit as well, not immediately, but in the future, as the city continues to grow and as demand for on-street parking intensifies, the city could consider a visitor parking permit. So if a household has an out-of-town visitor staying for multiple days, they can get a permit and park on street and not have to worry about being ticketed or towed. Parking enforcement is the second topic area, and I'll just speak to them at a very high level. There's 3 recommended actions. The first is to establish a spatial inventory of parking violations, which can include the warnings that are issued. It can include the tickets that are issued. So the city then has a better sense of where where the hotspots are, and can actually that can better inform what the restrictions could be, and just allow for better overall decision making around parking management. The second is to invest in parking enforcement technology. And the third is periodic enforcement for educational purposes. So when a new restriction comes in place, bylaw compliance officers could initially provide information about what those restrictions are before moving to ticketing. Sorry, Madam Chair, I see there's a few hands up. Should I continue the presentation?
Yeah,
or?
yeah, I will. Since we've got this far, I thought we'll hold our questions to the end.
Yep, thank you. There's just a few minutes left here. So the third topic area is time-limited parking. So we know that if parking is unrestricted, it can result in the abuse of the on-street stall and result in low turnover because there's really no mechanism to manage demand. A number of communities have time-limited parking. So, 1 hour restriction, 2 hour restriction, it could be a 15-minute restriction. It's fairly common in downtown areas or locations with commercial uses where you have a lot of customers and patrons looking for on-street parking. And we think this would be an important first step to help manage demand in the city as it continues to grow. But then as the city really starts to grow and expand with more commercial and residential development, demand for curbside parking will only increase. And at that point, we think consideration to paid parking would be appropriate. There's 4 recommended actions for time-limited parking. The first is to amend the bylaw to change the time limit from the 72 hours to 24 hours, 24-hour restriction, which is common in other municipalities. The second is to conduct on-street parking surveys in the urban centers. So these are the urban centers, really the amalgamation of the intended growth areas, the neighborhood centers, etc. So actually doing counts on parking occupancy and duration every couple of years to help inform what the time restrictions could be. Third is to establish time-limited parking in the city's urban centers, which I'll speak to in the next slide. And then finally, establishing commercial and passenger loading restrictions in the intended growth areas to really accommodate in the future ride-hailing services, food delivery services, and that kind of thing. So establishing time-limited parking in the city's urban centers, the rationale for this one is that in the off-street parking bylaw, the draft bylaw, there is a proposal to lower the parking requirements in the urban centers. So what that means is, or one potential implication of that is that there could be more spillover or more demand for on-street parking from residents, from employees, from customers. So the idea is that for for streets within the urban centers, just being proactive, starting to plan ahead, and look at different time-limited parking restrictions on those streets. So that can include Heatherly Road, for example, or Belmont Road, which is in Colwood Corners. Other locations could include the neighborhood center designations, mixed-use employment center, and Machosen and Lagoon neighborhood hub. The photos on the bottom here just show existing conditions, including Brookside Road and Latoria Walk, where you already have pretty high demand for on-street parking. And again, there's no restriction in place, so those vehicles could park for as long as they want. So the recommendations for this particular action are to start with the 2-hour restriction on roads within the neighborhood center, mixed-use employment center, and the Chosen and Lagoon neighborhood hub. Move toward time restrictions in the intended growth areas as development occurs, and also based on parking count data. Streets or blocks that are designated as residential permit parking only would be exempt from time-limited parking restriction, at least initially. So again, the idea is that you're really prioritizing the resident vehicle to park there and make sure that that on-street space is for them. However, over time limits for residential parking permit program might want to be introduced to prioritize parking for patrons. So on streets where you have a lot of commercial activity and a lot of customers looking for on-street parking, the idea is that you want to make sure that during the day, those stalls are for the patrons and not for the residents who really only need the parking overnight, for example. So last couple slides here, paid parking, there's a whole discussion in the report about paid parking, why it's important and its many advantages. The primary purpose of paid parking is to manage parking demand and not to necessarily generate revenue. We think that in Colwood's context, you need to start with time limits. once parking occupancy increases and time limited parking cannot effectively manage that demand, paid parking is what you want to turn to. And this is common practice in a number of municipalities who have started with basically no time restrictions and then moved to time restrictions and then moved to paid parking. In conclusion, as the city continues to grow, pressures on its on-street parking supply are anticipated to intensify, both from commercial and residential demands. The residential parking permit program in its current structure needs to be more transparent to the community in terms of what the criteria are, how to actually obtain a permit, and really ensuring that the permits are only issued on blocks where they're truly needed. And then lastly, time-limited parking restrictions will be required to facilitate short-term parking in the near future before the city moves to a paid parking system. Thank you for your attention and happy to answer questions.
Excellent. So first up for questions, Councillor Kobayashi.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for a good presentation, Tim. Enjoyed that, and I enjoyed reading your report. Actually, very easy to understand. I just have a quick question. Can you just tell me where that data came from? You say that 2019 data. Is that like the ICBC data, or is it what data is that? I've seen so many different numbers for number of cars per door in Colwood. Like I've seen it range up from 1 point, whatever you had there, to 1.8 or 8.5 or 1.9. So can you just tell me what the source of that data was, please?
Yes, through the chair to Councillor Kobayashi. That data is from the annual vehicle census from the city of Colwood. And if staff want to provide more details on that, it was a publicly available document that we found online that provided a detailed breakdown on the number of registered vehicles in the city of Colwood. So the annual vehicle census, just to be clear.
Mr. Earl?
Thank you. That particular data came from ICBC.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
much. Councillor Baxter. Oh, you're on mute.
I also enjoyed reading that report. It was very well written. I only have one question, in fact. It is believed that there are some people essentially staying overnight in some of our parking spots. Have you considered where they might go if they're pushed out by this type of parking restriction? And do you have any sense of how many people there might be doing that?
Through the chair, can I defer to staff on that, to
Sure.
Mr. Grant or Mr. Smith?
Good evening. Sorry, I don't have video tonight. Yeah, we are aware that there are people that sleep overnight in their vehicles. As for if time restrictions went to certain roads, we actually haven't really thought of where they would go. There is a time restriction now. If the vehicle's not registered to that street, they can park there for up to 72 hours and they have to move along anyways. But once again, we're complaint driven. So, you know, if we don't get complaints, they're tough to find some of these people. But to answer your question, you don't know where they would go to if we did put restrictions for parking on the streets.
Okay, I'd appreciate it if by the time we get an actual bylaw in front of us, that if staff could have given some thought to that. I'm not sure that we're going to get any answer, but if you can find an answer, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Yes, through the chair to Councillor Baxter, we would be happy to explore that and bring that data back for sure.
Thank you. And I guess as a final act, I'd like to move the recommendations.
Okay. Next, I have Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I got a bit of a list here. I'll be as quick as I can. I believe the foundation for all of this lies really by empowering our bylaw officers with this bylaw offense notice process. I was of the opinion that this was across the finish line or nearly so. If we can get some feedback on where we're at precisely and when we might feel that bylaw is going to be enacted.
Yeah, so that's definitely coincides with this report, and for lack of a better term, wanted to bring that back to life again. My predecessor, I believe, had that on the agenda September 8th, and council had a couple of questions relative to that, which we have actually been working on answering. So just finding it right here. It was essentially if there was, if our neighbors would explore cost sharing and things of that nature. So we have been doing that work, and we'll be looking forward to bringing that back to you shortly after this.
And
that answers the question.
Yeah, I would like to reinvigorate that and get cracking, because I think there's a few steps we need to take here that come from this report outside of what is in the recommendations. One of the questions I would have, I know mostly we've dealt with things by way of warnings. That's because if I was a bylaw officer, I would avoid the MTI process like the plague. So my question is a practical one. Can we safely assume that a number of those warnings would have been bylaw offense notices if that mechanism was in place? In other words, are we erring on the side of warnings because we don't want to deal with the MTI process?
I think it's a combination of that. Definitely strive for education before enforcement. But that being said, it definitely does give us an effective tool to issue a ticket when it is needed, and a lot more easily and a lot less cumbersome. So I'll definitely come back with the questions that were asked at that previous committee of the whole meeting, and definitely want to get this rolling as soon as possible for your consideration.
Thank you. And further to that, parking enforcement, in my mind, requires a proactive approach. And I think we're a number of years away from hitting some real pressure points, but time and time again, I hear about being complaint driven, and yet these mobile homes are still all over the community. And it pains me to no end to think that we sit back and we wait for someone to happen to call us or send an email versus our officer being proactive and banging on the door. And that's just a for instance, but parking in general, this can't be just reactive. And if we're taking all these steps and moving this forward, there needs to be a philosophical change in our approach. That's a statement, not a question, Byron. It's for my peers, I guess, mostly. Further, the file management system. I will not vote for anything that requires us to hire a team of staff to clerically enter a bunch of warning tickets or violation tickets into some kind of clunky old data processing software. So I do truly see the need for us to make some improvements with regard to the tools we provide our officers. It's not like we have 100 bylaw officers, we've got 2. So equipping them ought not to be too expensive with the technology that's out there nowadays, so that it can be directly input from the roadside, like many other enforcement agencies do already. I guess that's more of a statement as well.
And to get the conversation going too, I mean, one of the many appealing parts of the bylaw notice enforcement regulation is that our police department can assist us in some of the off hours, and the MTI format is a lot more cumbersome. So that's why those booklets that we provide are often left empty.
I would agree with that. So that's on the enforcement side. Some of the other signage and neighborhood issues. Is there a, and I didn't get this, but is there, does the time limit apply as well? Say we move to 24 hours, or the current 72 for that matter. Does the time limit apply to these RPO zones as well? Because what happens is when you put the signs up and hand out the permits, guess what? All of a sudden, that street doesn't belong to the city anymore. It belongs to those people that live in that block.
Rick, if you're on, are you available to answer that question?
Through the chair to Councillor Jansen, I believe there's a section in the Traffic and Highways bylaw for the permitted areas. They're exempt from the 24-hour or the 72-hour parking time limits.
Yeah, and that's, again, that just removes that strip of roadway from the public realm and turns it right over to the neighbors in that block. And I do have some difficulties with that, but I'll wait to hear what my peers have to say. The other thing in the neighborhood transit areas, or the identified, I can tell you a phenomenon in my neighborhood. People don't want to wait for the community bus, so they jump in their car, nip down the hill, save themselves half an hour, and park on the public street nearby to an express bus stop going along Soup Road. So again, if we can impact that phenomenon by turning in a bunch of these side streets of being for owners only or residents only, I think that precludes that possibility. And I think we should be encouraging that, not dissuading people from that. Any thoughts, Mr. Watt?
Through the chair to Councillor Jansen. Yeah, I mean, those are good points. I think really what we tried to outline in the report is that you first need to make these changes, or recommended changes around how you manage residential parking. Just so, again, the process is clear, and these permits are truly put on streets that actually require them, where you have quite a bit of spillover occurring. But all the recommendations around the time limited parking, as those are implemented over time, are really intended to, again, just try to create some turnover so people are not parking for hours upon hours, right. Especially in these commercial areas where you want customers to not park all day. So, anyways, Councillor Jansen, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question. I'm just trying to speak to what the recommendations are in the report.
That's great. No, that's good. And there might not be an answer at this time. Other factors.
I have Mr. Earl wishing to speak.
No, I don't really want to. No, I'm just kidding.
Thank you,
Mr.
Chair
Earl.
Day. Thank you. The decision to either exempt or not a residential permitted area from time limits rests with council. And so should the motion that's on the table now proceed, one of the first steps is to adopt the policy, and that policy would guide the community eventually as to whether or not in a residential permitted area, those with permits are fully exempt from either the 24-hour limit, the 72-hour limit, or a signed limit. Ultimately, that decision is council's.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Robert. I think lastly here, with the commercial, with our commercial zones here, I've heard this from other communities, and I've seen media reports in Vancouver where there isn't sufficient curbside commercial for the new gig economy here. We've seen the proliferation of skip the dishes and dial a bottle services and Ubers and what have you, and they're being ticketed and towed in Vancouver because there's no spots for the quick in and out pickups. So that is more just food for thought as we move forward and we start to identify some of these commercial areas. Thank you, Madam Chair. I see some of my peers have their hands up.
Yep. Okay, Mayor Martin.
Thank you, Chair. I guess the first point that I would just like to make to staff is that we had a wayfinding workshop. Significant time we invested into that, and one of the outcomes of that was attempting to make sure that our signage was in a positive form and not in a negative. And so I guess I would look to staff or to the consultants on how do you phrase signage so that it is in the positive and not in the restrictive or the negative. And then I have two other questions, Chair.
Mr. Shaw?
Thank you for the question, Mayor Martin. So through the chair, signage, there's a lot of really good examples out there, good precedents of wayfinding signage. I mean, even looking at the city of Victoria, for example, that just provides information about destinations and how far they are, using design, using arts to sort of make it more inviting and helping the person orient themselves to understand where the destination is, but then using the signage in such a way that's actually inviting, especially for tourists. So in the report, Mayor Martin, we don't get into wayfinding, like it's not part of the scope at all.
Yeah, sorry. Let me interrupt just so that you don't go down a path that I didn't intend for you to go down. I understand, yeah, and I appreciate the difference between wayfindage and parking signs. But part of our wayfindage workshop that we were doing was talking about parking signs and talking about where people should be allowed to park and not messaging negative, don't park here, or the negative of what that parking is. And so I guess I'm looking to you, do you have much experience with doing that, with providing it in a positive way versus a restrictive don't do it in a certain way?
So through the chair to Mayor Martin, what I've seen in other communities, other examples, it's often just, for example, if there's an off-street parking lot or a parkade, you might have digital signage, for example, that tells you how many stalls are available to the vehicle before they enter. That's an example of a positive, positive sign or positive messaging, where it's giving information to the driver so they can make a more informed decision. That's becoming a more common practice in a number of municipalities, but it's often in place when you have surface parking lots or parkades, not really for on-street parking.
Thank you. My second question is, in one of your slides, you mentioned that on average, our staff are investing about 8 hours a week on parking issues right now. And I believe the number was either 40 or 80 hours a week, which was the average for the other municipalities. Is that correct?
Through the chair, that's correct. Among the 11 communities that we sampled, it was about 80 hours of time on parking enforcement. For CRD municipalities, I think it was in the 30-hour range.
Okay, and the reason I point that out is that if we look into the report and we look at the financial consequences, staff have basically said that they would need direction from council first before they would be able to figure out the costs of the decisions that this council is making. I mean, I think it's obvious and easy for this council to figure out the financial consequences if we're only spending 8 hours a week right now doing it, and the average in the CRD is 30, and the average in the 11 municipalities that the survey was 80. That's going to require that we're going to need to see an increased level of service in our bylaw to enforce those hours. So, I mean, there's a significant cost that we can see right there that would be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Finally, the last thing I'll comment on is I have personal experience with permits. I lived 2 years on Government Street in the 400 block, and they were nothing but a pain. I probably got 3 tickets myself because the people didn't notice that I had a permit. And then I probably had to go to City Hall at least 10 times to get tickets written off for visitors that were visiting me, and that they parked in front of the house and ended up getting a parking ticket because there was no place else to go. And so then I had to go downtown and prove where I was parking. And so I don't actually see this as a panacea or an answer from a permit standpoint, but that's just my personal experience. Thank you, Chair.
Next, I have Councillor Parkinson.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for the report, Mr. Shaw. Good report. A few things I'll touch on here. Some have been said before. I'll just go through my laundry list, and if there's any appropriate responses, feel free to say so. I was wondering about the software that we had talked about ordering, and apparently that's coming. As far as writing tickets in the field, I know we looked at another expensive piece of software that was going to help building inspectors do their inspections reports digitally in the field. So hopefully that piece of software can also do the same for parking tickets. I don't know. But that's something to look into because, yeah, it should be as efficiently as possible. But enough on that. That's been talked to death. In your report, Mr. Shaw, you talk about free permits for on-street parking. And I struggle with that a little bit. You know, if we want to take, for example, Royal Bay, we zoned for 2 off-street parking spots with each lot, plus the garage, I believe. I may have it wrong. If there's a suite, there's an extra off-street parking spot. So it seems to me that if you have all that and you decide for whatever reason that you don't want to use it, you want to use the street, which we've all declared as a public space and for the public good, it should be very expensive to if you live on that street and you've done it. Now there may be neighborhoods in town that were developed without sufficient on-street parking for whatever reason. Maybe it's a different rule there, but I'm not so sure about encouraging people who live on a street to park on the street when a house has been built to accommodate that. The other thing is I do see sort of 2 separate areas, and I think you've addressed them well. The residential areas with the parking permit will have to come up, and I think you obviously understand the steps in the process, and good for you. So I'm happy with that. I was quite concerned when we were introducing parking standards for Royal Bay and Royal Beach that was going to encourage, if there was additional parking, was going to encourage people to go on the street, and that come future years when that street parking was clogging people who wanted to go to the businesses or the beach, that a future council would have great fights on their hand that wouldn't be thanking us. But you know, I'm convinced by what you say. Start with the time limited parking, and as long as it's instituted early enough, people will understand it. If they buy a unit, they'll understand that they're paying if they have to park on the street. So yeah, as I said, I'm very happy with your report, and you've moved my needle on when we should go with paid parking. I'm going to defer to your expertise on that one. So thank you.
Thank you. I just got a couple of issues that I would like to bring up. Mr. Shaw, when I was reading your report, it didn't touch on accessibility at all. And I thought that was problematic, only not because we have a lot of it, we don't have a lot of on-street accessible parking yet, but I am sure that we're going to need to have it in the future. So I just think that that accessibility is really important. And I'm wondering about your comments on requiring a maximum of on-street parking in employment centers, where that came from.
Thank you for the questions, Madam Chair. So the first question, as far as accessible parking goes, we're big believers in that. In fact, we're doing a large report right now for the city of Kelowna on the topic of accessible parking. So it's critical, and it was not addressed in this report because it was not explicitly part of the scope. Mr. Grant, Mr. Smith, and myself actually met with Accessible Parking BC, one of the lead advocates for accessible parking, about 3 weeks ago to understand this person's perspective on accessible parking, its importance, and considerations around on-street accessible parking. So we had a very good conversation around that, but we all I think we were all in agreement at the end of the conversation that this is something the city of Colwood is going to have to look at in the future. But right now, the first step is really getting a handle on residential parking and time limited parking. And then as the city continues to grow, making sure that there is direction on accessible parking. So does that answer your question, Councillor Day?
Well, I understand why you didn't include it, but I think it is critical. We do have people with disabilities who live here, and they live here now. And if you've ever had to shadow a person with a disability for a day, you would know that it's harder from the minute they get up to the minute they end. And every time they can be a little closer to make it more convenient to get through their day, doing the grocery store and whatever else you need to do. I think that's very important. I just didn't understand about the employment centers. You mentioned a couple of areas that I'm aware of issues, including Latoria Walk. What I'm noticing is some parts of the city, down Goldstream Avenue, for example, next to Colwood Corners, there's a considerable amount of long-term on-street parking going on there. And I know for a fact that many of those are employees who are working nearby. And some are residents, or, there's the whole gamut. But I'm just wondering why particularly targeting a maximum in employment centers.
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. That particular recommendation is it's a 2-hour time limited restriction in neighborhood centers, the mixed use employment centers, those designations in the OCP. So it's not exclusive to the employment centers, and really the rationale is that, whether it's Latoria Walk or Machosen Lagoon neighborhood hub, you already have customers parking on street, going to a cafe or some other commercial use, and there's currently no restriction in place. So the idea is that you want to encourage turnover of those stalls, especially as demand continues to increase. So it's really, the rationale really for that time restriction is actually intended for customers and not for employees. Although I do understand there could be a potential impact on employees if they do require, on-street parking for several hours. There's the risk that restriction would impact them. It's really intended for customers and patrons.
Great, thank you. Councillor Baxter, you had your hand up. Is that because you made the motion? You did make the motion.
Yes, I did, and I didn't take it down again. Sorry about that.
Okay, thank you. All right, I am going to call the question on the motion, which was to endorse the recommendations from the report. All those opposed? I am seeing none. So that is carried, and it is 8:39. I have a request for a bio break. If we could meet back here at 8:45, please. Okay, as soon as I see a couple more faces pop back on, we have Councillor Parkinson, Johnson, Kobayashi, Martin, Logan, and Baxter all back. And we are on to our next item from the agenda, 5.3. Mr. Borhill.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So tonight we've got our last item that is also dealing with parking. It was important for us to have this item, which is dealing with off-street parking. So that's privately owned parking as well as parking assigned to public uses off the street, along with this on-street parking item. So a lot of the feedback we received through this project actually related to the on-street parking. So it's another thing to consider in this. So tonight we've got the results of quite a bit of work that's been undertaken since last summer. There's been 3 working papers developed by our consultants at Urban Systems that were shared with council back in December. So you'll be forgiven if that was long ago in your memories. The results of this work now we're at the stage where we've got a draft parking bylaw and a draft variance policy. So we've got our lead consultant, Dan Casey, with us tonight that's going to walk us through those 2 deliverables. And the recommendation from staff tonight is simply for our committee to recommend endorsement of the 2 deliverables such that we would move on to final consultation with the public and then bring back the final documents for bylaw readings later on. We'd hope to get to that in about 6 weeks. With that, I'll introduce Dan Casey.
Good. Thank you, Ian. I'm just bear with me while I load up my slide deck here. Okay. Can we all see a red cover slide?
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you, Ian. Appreciate that introduction. Thank you, Mayor and Council, for allowing me to be here tonight. I'm pretty pleased and excited to be presenting on behalf of our team on this project that we've been working with your staff and with your community on over the past 10 months or so. So I'm here tonight to talk about off-street parking regulations bylaw and variance policy. I have about a 10 to 15 minutes overview of the materials and the background to the materials that were provided in your agenda package. Brief overview of what I'll speak to. First, overview of the project, the sort of the what and the why. Second, technical and engagement activities that were undertaken in developing these regulatory and policy documents. Third, some of the very key outcomes, and lastly, next steps. Why this project? This project was meant to align parking regulations with your official community plan directions. And so knowing that your OCP has been updated more recently, and the regulatory updates and revisions specific to parking that would go alongside it didn't happen at that time. So that's what we're dealing with now. This project is an opportunity to better align your land use, sustainability, and affordability objectives with how they're portrayed and how they're dealt with through your parking regulations. A key to this is having regulation and policy in place that requires the right amount of parking. And as I move through some of the material over the next few minutes, it'll become more clear what we mean by the right amount and how we're trying to address that. And then lastly, a key component to this project is clarifying expectations. And so that's for the city itself, for your residents, as well as for the development community. So we understand through parking and through provision of parking for development, we understand exactly what the city's expectations are and makes it clearer for everyone involved in the development process. Key project outcomes, there are 3 of them in terms of actual deliverables and regulatory and policy documents that come from this process. The first is the off-street parking regulations bylaw, which is all of the parking related regulations that are required. Currently, they're found in the land use bylaw. Once we're moved through this process and have finalized and endorsed regulatory documents, they would actually be removed from the land use bylaw, and they'd be entirely found within this new separate off-street parking regulations bylaw. The second key outcome is a parking variance policy. And so that deals with as applications come forward seeking variance on parking requirements. We have a policy in place that addresses that. And then lastly is an amending bylaw, which is required in order to decouple the current parking regulations from the land use bylaw and instead embed them in this, this new off-street parking regulations bylaw. A bit of background on the project timeline. I mentioned we've been at this since the summer of 2020, so about 10 months ago. We've got sort of 5 general project phases. First phase was really getting the initiative off the ground. Phase 2 was around data gathering and technical analysis, and I'll shed a bit of light on some of that work that was done. Importantly, that work concluded in a working paper number 1. Which has been on the project webpage for the duration of the process, giving the opportunity to see how some of this background work has been summarized and then pulled forward and reflected in subsequent project phases. Phase 3 was around engaging the community and stakeholders. So that took place mainly through the fall of 2020. And again, key takeaways contained in working paper number 2. Through the fall and into the winter of 2020 and trickling through into early 2021, we established key directions. And that was summarized in working paper number 3, which is really a precursor and key recommendations for the regulation and policy documents themselves. And then lastly, we find ourselves winter, spring 2021, where we're actually developing the documents themselves and working them through the formal endorsement process. I mentioned there was a community engagement component to this initiative. And so some of the key activities that were undertaken included a community survey back in the fall. We had a response rate of, I believe it was 87 responses from your community members. There were interviews with key stakeholders with an active interest in parking and parking regulations specifically. There was also a social media presence and a project webpage, a little snippet there in the center of the screen. And the project webpage provided some basic background information on the project, on the activities that would be undertaken, opportunities for engagement, and then the series of working papers were uploaded to the project webpage as they were finalized. Working paper series, I touched on this a little earlier, but working paper 1 was really about background and technical analysis. So it touched on your existing policy and regulatory framework. It had original parking demand data specific to your community, specific to the West Shore, and specific to Greater Victoria. That's helped us and the rest of the team understand what the real parking demand trends were or are in your community. Some options were brought forward. We also explored demand management and new mobility. Working paper 2 was a synopsis of community engagement activities and key feedback. And then working paper 3 included a number of prelim recommendations that were intended to sort of test options and give some direction to what the regulatory and policy documents might include. So I'll touch now on some of the key outcomes, and granted, this is really scratching the surface in terms of the amounts of information and detail that's actually in the regulatory document as well as the policy documents. So I'd encourage you to dig in and or ask questions if more details sought. So within the off-street parking regulations bylaw, the section on vehicle parking supply, some kind of key pieces to that included some relatively extensive updates to the minimum parking supply rates, as well as the land use classifications that are found in those vehicle parking supplies. And so that's, we went through a process of making sure that those land uses were aligned with the land uses and the classifications found in your land use bylaw. So there's a direct parallel between the two. Your development services and planning staff were extremely helpful in undertaking that work. Parking supply rates have been expressed independently by location. And so what I mean by that, and there's a map on the right for reference, is that for each well, for many of the land uses that are set out in terms of how parking supply requirements are expressed, we've actually broken many of those into urban areas versus other areas. And the idea being that those urban areas that fall within your OCP identified commercial centers, neighborhood centers, and transit corridors. The expectation is, and the data that we included in our background bore it out, was that parking needs are generally less in these areas, given mixed land uses, given higher densities, given the potential for walkability and access to public transit. And so for some of the key uses in that parking supply rate table, we've actually differentiated and provided a lower rate for those identified urban areas. And then lastly, through the parking supply requirements, there has been consideration and opportunities identified for where development forms through the supply and design of the parking, where they're supportive of city policy, is offering customization or relaxation built right into the regulations to continue to encourage the kinds of development forms that we want to see in Colwood. In terms of vehicle parking design requirements, a few key pieces on the screen in front of us. First being that one of the pieces that from a functional perspective that we wanted to get in there was a requirement for where a stall abuts a vertical obstruction, something that the functional, so when typically a vehicle pulls into a parking stall, the nose or a corner of it might swing into the adjacent stall. And as long as the adjacent vehicle isn't parked right up to the edge of their stall, that's okay. Where a wall or a pillar or vertical columns in place, that's not okay, obviously. So we wanted to build in a little bit of extra space to allow for that maneuvering. So that's one item. The tandem parking piece has been included for both townhouses and suites. And so the key piece being that it's got to be occupants of the same unit must, their vehicles must occupy those stalls that are provided in tandem. And then the some other key pieces around basically heightening the quality of off-street parking facilities. And so some basic requirements for landscaping and street trees, as well as requirements for pedestrian facilities in larger parking lots. And so sometimes those items can be provided at the applicant's discretion or even at the coaching of staff of the city, but by getting them into regulation, you ensure that you get those. Specialty vehicle parking. So we've identified requirements for energized parking stalls, a portion of stalls to be energized. So that means EV ready. And so there's specific consideration given to EV ready for all multifamily residential, and then EV ready for a smaller component of commercial, institutional, and industrial land uses. Also, we've got new draft accessible parking supply, accessible parking design, and signage and pavement marking requirements associated with accessible parking that we believe line up quite well with the need for accessible parking in your community, as well as designed and marked in such a way that improves the usability and quality of those spaces. Considerations are included for bicycle and mobility scooter parking. So a big one has been updating the bicycle parking supply requirements to include separating out the requirements for short-term versus long-term. So short-term generally being racks that are intended for customers or residential visitors or shorter stays. Long-term being those that are found in enclosed facilities, cages, secured lockers. We're suggesting that the bike design requirements have a bit of an overhaul to make sure that they're fully functional and safe and secure. And one of the key components of that includes a provision for oversized bicycles like cargo bikes and trikes, so that a certain percentage of bike parking spaces are designed to allow for these larger bicycles, which are becoming increasingly more common. The draft regulations also include requirements for trip end facilities. So those being facilities that help support cyclists who might commute over a moderate or longer distance, typically toward a commute destination like a commercial use, institutional use. And so the idea being that's a requirement for shower, change room, locker, wash basin, basic amenities at the cycling trip end. And then lastly, requirements for mobility scooter parking that ensure that there's dedicated space, so not necessarily leftover or retrofitted space, but dedicated space built in to accommodate mobility scooters. So shifting from the off-street parking regulations bylaw to the parking variance policy, it's a 3-page document, and really its intent was to clarify what the city's expectations are, where parking variances are going to be considered. And so really providing that clarity is the clarity over the conditions under which the city will consider a variance is really what's of most importance. And so there are 5 items that are specifically called out in the variance policy as conditions that may warrant parking variance. Number 1 being housing diversity, and so market rental or affordable housing as opposed to typical market owned multifamily housing. 2 being transportation demand management options, things like car share or bike share, things like cycling amenities above and beyond what's required, also support for public transit. 3 is related to transit proximity. And so importantly, we've already, the baseline parking requirements already build in a reduction for proximity to your identified priority transit corridors. And so this cannot be used to double count on that. This transit proximity piece may take in sites that have access to decent transit service with decent level of transit available to residents or commercial sites, but which isn't already taken in the baseline requirements. Number 4 is around shared parking, and where an applicant can demonstrate that the parking demand characteristics of 2 or more land uses on a site are complementary and they don't need their full parking allocation at overlapping times. And then 5 is where parking facility design goes above and beyond what is required, and the provision of a high quality facility is deemed as rationale for reduction. So with that variance policy, the draft policy includes the requirement for a technical study that would substantiate 1 or more of these conditions for the variance. And then also included is a referral to staff for minor variances. And so the idea being where a variance is small in number, that those variances could not make their way to council. Instead, they'd be dealt with at the staff level. And so that helps streamline things a little bit, as well as minimize the volume of material coming to council. And the third key takeaway is this amending bylaw. And I mentioned this is really the piece that decouples all of the parking related regulations from the land use bylaw and is the updating piece to that land use bylaw, so that those parking regulations no longer reside in that bylaw, and instead the reference is to the new off-street parking regulations bylaw. So I'll summarize on next steps. We're here tonight seeking direction from council. From this, we intend to address any key feedback, and we are looking to make these documents available for public review and feedback. Assuming we move forward with that, there'd be a public review period with the materials available on the project webpage. And we would take feedback from the public, give consideration, make updates, and come back to council for final endorsement. So with that, I'll summarize, and I welcome any questions or feedback you might have. Thank you.
Great. I will recognize Mayor Martin.
Thank you, Chair. I just turned off my video while I was watching the presentation. In regards to bikes, and you mentioned about bike storage and providing those spots. My specific question was around e-bikes and the increased use of e-bikes? And does that take into account the ability to charge those e-bikes? So would that be, has that been sort of put into the mix? Also, I would like to get a comment from you in regards to the charging stations. And has there been any growth in making that more multimodal, so that it could be dealing more than just the car, that it could be charging the e-bikes, the scooters, like, and is that a healthy interaction if we had that type of parking? Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Casey.
Good questions, and through the chair. So your first question was around charging for electric bicycles, and so in the draft regulation includes a regulation that would require that 20% of all short-term, so bike racks and sort of shorter-term bike parking spaces, 20% would have access to a 110 volt outlet for charging, and that 50% of all long-term spaces would as well. And so that has been built into the draft, and the feeling is that those levels are sufficient for the number of e-bicycles we're seeing. To your second question around different multiple modes using the same sort of charge point to charge up, I think I don't honestly myself have a lot of background or understanding on that. I think one of the with EV charging, you generally have 3 distinct charging levels. The level 1s are the 110 volt, the kind of the modified wall plugs, versus levels 2 and level 3. They are entirely different magnitude of charging facility, and would generally provide much more power than your typical e-bike or mobility scooter would actually require to charge. And so I honestly don't know myself what the capability of doing that might be on one of those level 2 or fast chargers.
Okay, so I guess, sorry, through the chair.
No problem.
So I guess my point was, I was thinking more about the interaction versus the actual power supply. Like, have we done any studies, or has there been any work done around, is that a healthy interaction to be having e-bikes and real cars, electric cars, plus maybe a scooter or something coming in and interacting with each other around that same charge point? Is that something that we should be encouraging or discouraging?
Madam Chair?
Yeah, Mr. Borhill.
If I could address the mayor's questions through you. I think this is the perfect time for us to be hearing these types of questions. Right now, we're looking at taking key feedback from the committee and as well as council. So I'm taking careful notes here, and information like this that we don't have readily available, we will turn forthwith within the comment period if committee is so interested in forwarding this bylaw.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. That's all my questions.
Excellent. Next, I have Councillor Parkinson.
Thank you, Chair. First, I should start with an apology. I have to confess, I haven't had time to absorb all this information. And while we're told that we've had the working papers there for us to read for quite some time, it never raised to the top of my radar. I haven't really absorbed them. I've tried to flip through them recently. A lot of stuff here. I got some questions. I think it's a great start tonight to have some policy discussions. I'm supportive of having a dedicated parking bylaw, but at some point I'd like to defer this for a couple of meetings to get time to absorb some of the questions that go on here. And just maybe I'll just whip through my list of questions here, and you know, if there's responses available, that would be great. If it takes some time, that's okay too. I guess one of the concerns I had when I was flipping through working paper number 1, I just got to the condo numbers, and by coincidence, the number at the top of the list was the condo I lived in, and it had the wrong number of units and the wrong number of parking stalls occupied. And so, of course, that underestimated significantly. And I don't want to make a big deal about this. There's a lot of numbers in the report, and I understand that it's hard to get them all. I haven't followed how that translates into creating averages. And I worry, of course, that if we create a bylaw that's underestimating parking requirements, it's going to be one of those problems that doesn't show up for a number of years. And it's going to be basically a hell of a problem to solve if we get there. So we want to get it right. So that's just something, as I said, I don't understand how that translates into the rest. Interesting to me that we have a lot of information on parking stalls, electric vehicles, that kind of stuff. Nowhere in here do we talk about parking for pickups and vans. You know, we earlier tonight we talked about on-street parking and who could park there, and limiting parking to a couple of hours and stuff like that. But a number of our community work, they're tradesmen, and we want to have tradesmen in our community, but they may have a van with ladders on top and equipment that just doesn't fit into a parkade. So, what do we do about those parking stalls, and what do we do about that? And it just seems to me that it is something that should be addressed as we hone in tighter and tighter on all these regulations. And of course, I can't compute the differences between the old numbers and the new numbers and what they really mean. And I was wondering if, since we have active in our community now, a new grocery store coming and a new congregate care coming, if we could just look at what those numbers of parking requirements would be under the old rules and the new rules, just to see if there's significant difference, no difference, and hear from the proponents of those projects what they think of those ones. I think that would be useful. I got to admit, I'm not as concerned about oversupply as this report is. If somehow parking requirements turned out to be a little generous as vehicle ownership may go down in the years to come, pretty easy to deal with too much parking. Put on pickleball courts or ping pong tables or food trucks, or a whole bunch of things you can do if there's too much parking. It's the underparking that I worry about. And I'm not as convinced as others that the car ownership and vehicle ownership is going to go down. I think, like others, I think we need to get rid of the greenhouse gas component. But as a proponent of electric cars, I'm not so sure people are going to own less cars. And even if they take transit, they may still own a car or two, just because the maintenance costs and longevity of electric cars are supposed to be significantly more than what they are. I guess I'd also kind of like to understand how these parking numbers compare to the ones that we recently approved for Royal Bay and Royal Beach. Are they sort of similar, or are we lower, higher? Don't know. And then one question that came up during Mr. Casey's presentation, when he did get into widening parking stalls next to an obstruction or something. And I thought of how I park every night next to the concrete pillar in the parkade. And I go, would that apply in parkades as well? And how much does that increase the size of a parkade? And is it appropriate if that's what it does? So just a number of questions. And as I said, I had more questions now than answers. Supportive of doing a new parking bylaw, but I am cognizant of our responsibility to get it right. So as I said, I would be happy to defer this for a month or so to really give me time at least to digest. I don't know if the rest of you had time to go through all the working papers and everything. Anyway, those are some thoughts off the top of my head.
Thank you. Councillor Baxter.
Yeah, I have a few questions. There was a mention of maximums. So not only a minimum number of parking spots, but a maximum. And yet I couldn't find that anywhere in the documents other than a mention that it would be. Can somebody tell me where I missed that?
Through the chair, I'm happy to point that one out. So section 3.1.3 in the off-street parking regulations bylaw. So 3.1 and then 3 and 4. And so those are addressing it's somewhat of a soft maximum. So it does allow a little bit of room between the minimums expressed and the maximums. And we thought that was a way that that it would allow a little bit of flexibility without being too rigid, and by being too rigid, you run the risk of getting into the variance thing again, where you end up with a large number of variances.
Okay, so I'm looking at 3.1.3, and it says where the parking supply for a lot may exceed the minimum requirement by up to 10%. And then it says the access shall be provided as structured parking. Can you tell me what that means?
So the minimum is set at, whatever it is, depending on the land use. And then once an applicant exceeds that minimum, they basically can go 10% above that minimum without issue. And then after that, parking is to be provided in structure. And so the idea is, from a land use and alignment with the official community plan, you get parking facility. The fear with some of the potentially excessively sized parking facilities is that it degrades from your pedestrian realm, and it results in lower densities in areas where you might want higher densities. And so the idea being that if parking is provided above and beyond what that minimum is, that it's done so in a structure. So we get away from these issues of pedestrian realm degradation and reduced densities and whatnot.
So you don't have a hard maximum in the bylaw, but you're adding cost by saying it's going to go structured. And so that will tend to prevent excessive additions. So I'm thinking of, I was involved when Costco was built, for instance, and they built far beyond the required parking because they want to allow for the Christmas crowd. And so if that were to happen, if something like that were to happen under this bylaw, you would be involved in much more cost in that excess parking than you would in the regular parking.
Correct.
Okay, great.
Madam Chair, if I could just add, Councillor Baxter's hit the nail on the head. We really don't see this being something that's required to be employed that often. It's really in the rare occasion where large format retail, big boxes proposed. I can only think of one occasion. It'd be at the Colwood Corners development where we had this issue, and really all of the goals of the official community plan or the design guidelines would have been solved by putting that parking under a structure or underground. So that's why.
Yeah. Okay, very good solution. I like it. Right, sorry, trying to find my next question. Oh, I just wanted to point out something in your report, Mr. Borhill. There's a reference to the city has already installed, it's talking about electric chargers at Royal Bay Bakery and Royal Roads University. Well, Royal Bay Bakery installed their own, although the city did facilitate a grant. But Royal Roads University built virtually all of their own entirely on their own. And I don't think we want to take the credit away from them. Just for your information. So the definition of an energized space for an EV doesn't say what level of energizing. And for the information of the consultant, an EV charging at a 110 outlet, it can be any 110 outlet as long as there's nothing else on the circuit. So it has to be a special circuit, but the plug is totally normal. So what is with this definition of energized space, all of the spaces would be 110 volt because that's the cheapest option for the builder. Is that our intent?
Correct. Yeah, it's not, as you've pointed out, it's not been specified what the voltage, what the level would be.
Okay, because when I bought my first EV, I lived in a suite and I only had access to about 110 volt. and that was okay, but that was an EV that had a range of 140 kilometers. Today's EVs are 3 times that. And if you're using a good bit of that capacity on consecutive days, you're not going to be able to charge up overnight. That said, not everybody needs a level 2, which would charge you up overnight. So it would be useful to have in these regulations that the structure includes some level 2s that are available. They're freely available. Nobody parks there for those odd occasions when you just absolutely need the level 2 to charge up.
I'm running up against a couple of administrative issues here, so I'm just going to burst in for a moment as your chair to try to ask for your help to sort them out. I was trying to give everyone an opportunity to speak at least once, but we are up to 9:20 and we will require a motion to go later than 9:30. And I also heard Councillor Parkinson asking for more time. In other words, potentially a motion to refer, but I hate to accept that type of motion when not everyone has spoken yet or had a chance to ask their questions. So I just am asking to test the House. Would you like to give this report more time? Staff, please let me know if there's a reason that you need us to consider it now. But I have Councillor Kobayashi with his hand up. I haven't had a chance to ask my questions. Councillor Parkinson did mention that he needed more time with the material. So what is the will of council?
Chair, the first thing, could I just clarify, because it's just a point of order that you mentioned, and I believe you mentioned that it's 3 hours after we start, and I believe it may be 3.5 in our procedural bylaw, and I'm not sure. So I just wanted to check with staff because I actually thought it was 3.5, but I've heard you say that a couple of times. So could we get a clarification? Is the procedural bylaw 3.5 hours from the beginning of this meeting, not to go past 10, or is it 3 hours no matter what time we start the meeting?
I'll let staff answer.
I believe that it's 3 hours. So when we used to start at 7, it would be, the time limit would be 10 o'clock. And because we now start at 6:30, it is 9:30.
Okay, thank you. I stand corrected.
Mr. Borhill?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to add, following up on your comments, that there is no time concerns from staff's perspective with respect to this item coming back to the next committee of the whole meeting for additional comment. Really, the only timing consideration was that we were going to bring this forward with the previous report that was dealing with on-street parking.
Okay. So I have Councillor Kobayashi's hand is noted. I'm going to put everybody's hands down. I am looking for a motion. Either we're going late past 9:30 or we're referring this to committee of the whole. I would like to see us take the time that we need to get this right. I see a hand. Councillor Kobayashi.
Thank you very much, Chair Day. I would like to make the motion to refer this. I feel the same way as Councillor Parkinson, and you know, I shame on me. I did read the report, and it said that the appendixes were attached, and I didn't realize it. And I looked at the package, and I was going, God, and I had all these questions, and then I found out that they weren't attached. And if you click on the link, you can get them electronically, and it's another 200 pages actually. And actually, it answers a lot of the questions as I went along. So I can tell you that I have not, shame on me, I did not have the time to fully digest everything. I looked at it in a cursory view, and therefore I have the same request. I was going to ask for a referral myself. Thank you. So I make it the motion to refer.
Okay, we have a motion to refer to the next committee of the whole, correct? So I'm just going to put those hands down. The only discussion on a motion to refer is to its appropriateness. So I'm going to, because of the hour and everything else, I'm going to put all the hands down and I'm going to call the question on the motion to refer. All those opposed, please raise your hands. No one is opposed, so we will carry on this discussion at our next committee of the whole, and you'll all find those 200 extra pages. I believe with that motion, that brings us to the end of our agenda.
Point of order, Madam Chair. Point of order.
Yes.
I had not quite finished my question, so if you could include me in your speakers list for next time.
Certainly.
Thank you.
All right. Our next meeting is Monday, May 17th. And I'm looking for a motion to adjourn for this evening. Moved by Councillor Logan. Surprise, surprise. Thank you all so much. That was a great discussion. Thank you to staff and participants. Good night, all.
Thanks all. Good night.